Hola chicos, I am still stuck quarantining, but I wanted to join you today because today is the day that we will be discussing Chapter 4 of Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States. That chapter is entitled Tyranny is Tyranny, and this is one of my favorite chapters of the book. I also think it's an extremely useful resource when it comes to answering our big question: how revolutionary was the American Revolution? Or perhaps, how revolutionary was it not? Hopefully you've already completed the reading and done your discussion prep for the day and have your understandings and your quotes and your questions and your opinions. You will be using those in an online discussion board. And since I cannot be there with you to facilitate that discussion, I thought that I would post some of my own main takeaways from this chapter in this video. So here we go. I've said this before and I'll probably say it again, but one thing that I think is super important to remember about the American Revolution is that during that time, America was not a monolith. When I say monolith, I mean a unified group of people that we simply can call Americans who share the same perspectives and experiences and interests in regards to what's happening in their country at that time. And while I suppose that American is technically an accurate term for anybody that's living in America, for some groups of people, this might be the full extent of the similarities that exist between them. So while the American Revolution is generally about a conflict between some Americans and the British, this chapter definitely supports the understanding that it's a lot more complicated than that. Allow me to read my quote aloud. The leaders of the independence movement wanted to use that mob energy against England, but also to contain it so that it would not demand too much from them. Cool quote, bro, but what's it mean? Let's break it down. Let's start with the leaders of the independence movement. Who are they? When I think of the leaders of the independence movement, I think of guys like George Washington, John and Sam Adams, Patrick Henry, Benjamin Franklin, and Thomas Jefferson, who is perhaps the most useful example when it comes to the interpretation that I want to make here. But first, the rest of the quote. What's the mob energy? The mob energy would be, well, the energy of the mob. The groups of people who were rising up in rebellion against things like the Stamp Act and the tea tax and the quartering of British troops. And this quote said that the leaders, like Jefferson, wanted to use that mob energy against Great Britain, but also contain it so it didn't demand too much from them, the leaders. What does that mean? Guys like Thomas Jefferson are all about riling up the unwashed masses when it comes to independence from Great Britain. That's why Jefferson wrote all those pretty words about liberty and equality and the pursuit of happiness. If you're a poor person living on the streets of Boston, that talk of liberty and equality probably sounds pretty good to you. But here's the dilemma for a guy like Jefferson. What if all that talk about liberty and equality was turned around and used on him? Jefferson was a pretty rich dude. What if the poor people from the American colonies decided that they wanted equality with him? What if people were to say that liberty should also be applied to the slaves that Jefferson owned? Jefferson is playing a dangerous game here because those are probably versions of liberty and equality that he doesn't really want. Hence this quote, utilize the energy of the mob in order to gain independence from Great Britain and free guys like Jefferson from British rule, but also contain that mob energy so it doesn't get too wild and too crazy and start demanding stuff from guys like him. Another great example of how the interests of different groups during the American Revolution, in this case the rich and the poor, not only were sometimes different, but oftentimes contradictory. The title of this chapter is Tyranny is Tyranny. My question? What does that mean? To answer that question, you first need to know what tyranny is, and if you give it a quick Google, you'll find that tyranny is a cruel or oppressive government. So tyranny is tyranny must mean that a cruel or oppressive government is a cruel or oppressive government. But what cruel or oppressive government are we talking about here? It says tyranny twice, so we must be talking about two cruel and oppressive governments, and the first one's pretty easy to figure out. It's Great Britain, the same government that was levying all those oppressive taxes against American colonists that didn't even have representation in Parliament, and forcing American colonists to give shelter and resources to the British soldiers that were gunning down Bostonians in the street. So it's understandable why people living under the British government might feel like they're living under tyranny. But what's the other tyrannical government? This title is taken from the last line of the chapter, in which Zinn is sharing a story about a military draft for the Revolutionary War that took place in Boston. According to Zinn, rich people could avoid military service by simply paying a fee, whereas the poor people who couldn't afford that fee were forced to fight. In response, the poor people of Boston began to riot, shouting the chant, "Tyranny is tyranny, let it come from whom it may." To them, this new American government was revealing itself to be just as tyrannical as the old British one, allowing wealthy people to pay for special privileges while the poor were forced to go and fight and die for a cause that they didn't even necessarily believe in. What difference does it make to a poor man if his rulers are British or American? It's not like Thomas Jefferson was going to drop off a sack of money on his doorstep in the name of equality after the American Revolution was won. And the same can be said for a lot of groups in America during this time. Does it matter to an enslaved black whether his owner is a loyalist or a patriot? Does it matter to the natives that the land that was stolen from them belongs to a British colony or a newly independent nation? Do women have any more of an ability to participate in this new American government than they did in the old British one? For many people from these groups, the answer was no, no, and no. The Declaration of Independence may have talked about the lofty ideals of liberty and equality and natural rights, but that didn't mean that all Americans experienced them. Which is why, for many people now living in the new nation of the United States of America, the British may have been gone, but the tyranny remained. So based on everything I've talked about in this video, it is my belief that if you were to ask Zinn our question of how revolutionary was the American Revolution, his response would be, not very. Towards the end of the chapter, Zinn even describes the American Revolution as a myth, based on a fantasy that this revolution was carried out on behalf of a united people in the name of liberty and equality. And he's got a good point. Like, if the word revolution means change, then the American Revolution was pretty unrevolutionary for a lot of different groups of people. However, even if they weren't fulfilled at that moment in time, one thing that I don't think you can forget when talking about the revolutionariness of the American Revolution is the ideas. To be sure, liberty and equality were not experienced by all Americans right away, and still aren't experienced fully by all Americans today. But when a slave owner from Virginia wrote those words down on a piece of paper declaring independence from Great Britain, he let out a genie that he could never put back in the bottle. Over the decades and centuries to come, Jefferson's words will be quoted by all kinds of Americans in their battles to bring more freedom and equality to the American experience. And if you count those changes as part of the American Revolution, then the American Revolution brought a lot more change over the long run than it did in the short run. Which is why, even though I agree with a lot of what Zinn says, it is my opinion that the American Revolution is a little bit more revolutionary than what Zinn is giving it credit for. So those are my main takeaways. I hope that this helps you make some more sense of a complicated chapter and perhaps gives you some more insight as we continue to wrestle with our big question for the unit. And I look forward to reading your takeaways on the online discussion board and seeing the insights that you gained from reading this radical perspective on America's revolutionary history. Adios.